In 1971, a single televised announcement quietly ended the global financial system as everyone knew it.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
No warning, no negotiation, just one man canceling a 27-year-old promise on live television. And here's what makes it strange. The country that broke the system became more powerful because of it. The dollar didn't collapse, it got stronger. It became something no currency had ever been before. A weapon, a surveillance tool, a leash. Today, almost 90% of every currency trade on Earth touches the dollar, half of all international payments, most of global trade finance, and every single transaction flows through pipes the United States controls. But something is shifting.
Now recently, a lot of the central banks in the world have been buying gold. In fact, they've been buying more gold now in the last 12 months than probably any time since the early 70s.
Central banks are quietly buying gold at the fastest pace in 50 years. China is building parallel payment networks. Saudi Arabia is selling oil in yuan. But the dollar isn't crashing. It's something more interesting than that. The dollar is losing its monopoly, and the people who built the system are the ones who broke it. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to a hotel in New Hampshire, in the middle of a world war. July 1944. 44 nations show up at the Mount Washington Hotel, the meeting that history would remember as Bretton Woods. The Second World War isn't even over yet, but everyone in that room knows something. Whoever writes the rules of money after this war wins the next century. The deal was simple. Every currency was tied to the dollar. The dollar was fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. The United States held 2/3 of all the gold on the planet, so they set the terms. For 27 years, this worked, until it didn't. There's a problem nobody at Bretton Woods wanted to talk about. It's called the Triffin dilemma. If the world needs dollars to function, the US has to keep pumping them out. But the more dollars float overseas, the less they're backed by gold in Fort Knox. The system was slowly breaking itself. Then Vietnam happened, then inflation. By 1971, France was literally sending warships to pick up its gold. The math was broken. So on August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon goes on television on a Sunday night, interrupting the most popular show in America, and ends the gold standard.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
The promise from 1944 is dead. In theory, this should have been catastrophic for the dollar. Instead, within 3 years, the United States pulled off something even more audacious. They replaced gold with something better. In 1974, Henry Kissinger flies to Saudi Arabia. The deal he negotiates is one of the most consequential handshakes of the 20th century, and almost nobody in America knew it was happening. Here's the offer. Saudi Arabia sells its oil in dollars, only dollars, every barrel. The petrodollars they earn, they funnel back into US Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States provides military protection, weapons, and a security umbrella over the entire Saudi kingdom. By 1975, every OPEC nation followed. Think about what this meant. If you're any country on Earth and you need oil, then you need dollars. The world had to hold dollars to keep the lights on. The French had a name for what America had just won. They called it the exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the world's money and have the world fight to hold it. But privilege isn't enough on its own. What the US built next turned the dollar into a weapon you could fire from a desk in Washington. The dollar isn't just paper, it's an operating system. Almost every international dollar transaction on Earth has to pass through a clearinghouse in New York. Doesn't matter if a French bank is paying a Brazilian company. If it's in dollars, it touches American soil, and it touches American law. Which means every bank on Earth, the moment it moves dollars, is under US jurisdiction. Once Washington realized what they had, they built tools around it. OFAC, a small agency with the power to freeze accounts in any bank touching the dollar system anywhere on Earth. And SWIFT, the messaging network that 11,000 banks use to talk to each other. Cut a country out of SWIFT and its banks go dark. Trade stops, imports collapse, and the currency crashes. People in finance call it the financial nuclear option. Iran felt it first in 2012. But before Iran, there was someone else who tested the limits of the system. And what happened to him sent a message the entire world heard, loud and clear. Here's a story that gets buried in most history books. In the year 2000, Saddam Hussein did something nobody had dared to do. He announced that Iraq would stop selling its oil in dollars. From now on, only euros. At first, Washington laughed it off. Analysts called it a political stunt. Then the euro started rising. Iraq's oil revenues climbed. The stunt was suddenly making real money. Other oil producers started watching. A crack was forming in the petrodollar wall. In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Officially, the reason was weapons of mass destruction.
There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No question whatsoever.
Weapons that, as we now know, were never found.
It was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes. They lied. Okay. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
But here's the part that's hard to ignore. One of the very first economic decisions made after Baghdad fell, before the dust had even settled, was switching Iraq's oil sales back to dollars. The message every oil-producing nation took home from 2003 was simple. The petrodollar isn't a suggestion, it's a rule. And rules like that get enforced one way or another. But 2 decades later, a different kind of challenge would emerge, one that couldn't be solved with cruise missiles, and the response to it would be the moment the system started breaking itself. February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. Within days, the response from Washington is unprecedented. 7 major Russian banks cut from SWIFT. Then comes the move that shocked every finance ministry on Earth. The United States and its allies froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, a G20 central bank's national savings. The ruble crashed over 30% in weeks. Russia's central bank cranked interest rates to 20% overnight. It looked like a triumph of financial power. But in Beijing, in Riyadh, in New Delhi, every central banker on Earth was asking the same quiet question. If they can do this to Russia, when could they do it to us? What the United States had just demonstrated was that dollar reserves aren't really an asset. They're a political promise, and political promises can be canceled. That single decision triggered something the architects of the dollar system never planned for: a worldwide hedge. Here's what's happened since 2022, and almost nobody in mainstream media is talking about it. Central banks around the world are buying gold at the fastest pace in 5 decades. Over 1,000 tons a year, 2 years running, more than double the pace of the previous decade. The buyers? China, Russia, Turkey, India. China has nearly tripled its gold holdings and quietly shed nearly half its US Treasury exposure since 2010. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 72% to 56%, the lowest in 3 decades. And here's the part that breaks the petrodollar's spine. Russia and China now do over 99% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan, not dollars. Saudi Arabia's biggest oil buyer today isn't America, it's China, taking over 20% of Saudi exports. Shanghai even launched yuan-denominated oil futures back in 2018. The petrodollar monopoly that Kissinger built in 1974 is no longer a monopoly. Now, let's be honest about the limits. The yuan still handles only 2 to 4% of global payments. BRICS is too divided to truly unify, and the US Treasury market at over $28 trillion has no real competitor. The dollar isn't falling, but for the first time in 80 years, it has competition. When you zoom all the way out, the story of the dollar is the story of every empire in history. It rises through a brilliant construction. It peaks by turning that construction into a tool of discipline, and it begins to fade not because someone defeats it, but because the people running it use the tool too often. That's the real lesson here. The dollar's strength was never about gold or oil or treasuries. It was about trust. And every time the United States used the dollar as a weapon, it taught the rest of the world that dollars come with conditions, that neutrality was always an illusion. We are not living in the moment of the dollar's fall. We're living in the moment of its fragmentation. The world isn't replacing the dollar, it's quietly building backups. Not because anyone has a better system, but because everyone wants insurance. The dollar will probably still be the world's most important currency a decade from now. It just won't be the only one that matters. And the privilege that funded American power for 80 years is being negotiated, transaction by transaction, in rooms where America no longer has the only seat at the table. So what's your take? Is the dollar's era really ending? Or will it still be the world's currency a decade from now? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.